Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon to those of you back east. My name is Dan Balkaran, and I'm going to be doing a live employment law Q&A session with you, where I'll be answering your questions live. As always, I want to remind everyone that if you have any other further questions, please go to employmentlawyer.ca, or you can email us at help@employmentlawyer.ca, and of course, you can call us at 1-855-821-5900. And if you have any sort of quick and easy questions, you can always go to pocketemploymentlawyer.ca. Okay, welcome to everybody. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Please submit them to me as you have them, and I will review them. If not, or while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I will be happy to discuss the sort of the hot button topic that everyone is talking about right now, which is employers imposing mandatory vaccine policies on their employees. So while I'm waiting for questions to come in, I'll just start talking about mandatory vaccines. So it's important when you think about mandatory vaccines to understand what it is and what it is not, or at least as far as my discussion with you today, what I will be talking about and what I will not be talking about. So what I will be talking about, that's a very good question that just came in. How do I prove religious exemption for vaccination status? Okay, well, let me just finish what I was saying, and then I'll tackle that one. So what I will be talking about is the impact of vaccine mandate policies on your employment and then your rights arising from same or from the termination of same. What I will not be talking about is providing any opinion or commentary on the provincial, at least in British Columbia, and I understand Ontario might be moving towards that, on vaccine passports, as that's a separate political issue from employment law. So let me tackle the questions that came in. First question is, how do I prove a religious exemption for vaccine status? Well, it's a very, very good question. There's no cut and dry, easy answer to that question. I think the best way to do that, though, would be if you got a note, in the same way if you have a medical issue, if you get a note from your doctor talking about how you're exempt from X or Y, or in this case, the vaccine, a note from your religious leader, like a priest or a rabbi or whatever your denomination is, explaining what, that you're an adherent of the particular faith, and also why you can't possibly get the vaccine for religious reasons. I think that will go a long way towards proving the exemption. But with all of this, it's important to understand this is all brand new. We've never had a pandemic before, and so, or at least not in the last 100 years. And so it's not cut and dried exactly how religious exemptions will look. But I suspect if you get a note from your religious leader that explains why it is that you can't get the vaccine, I think that will go a long way towards meeting an exception for you, or an exemption for you. Okay, next question. What rights do I have as a unionized professional to refuse the vaccine? My union seems to be pro-vaccination. Unfortunately, the collective bargaining agreement that you struck with your union entirely governs your employment relationship, subject to the Labor Relations Act and other legislation. So unfortunately, that question is something that you're going to have to ask to your union representative. I can't answer that for you, because it depends entirely on what's in your collective bargaining agreement. So please do speak to your union representative. If an employer has a document, they have a lawyer prepared to keep your position, do you have to sign it? Can they fire you without cause if you refuse to sign it? I don't quite understand your question, Adam. If employer has a document, a lawyer has prepared for them to keep your position, do you have to sign it? Adam, if you could clarify your question a little bit, because I don't actually understand what your question is. Christine, if an employer is mandating you to be tested, if not vaccinated, do they have to let you do it on company time? We're being told that testing has to be completed on your own time. Well, I think with all of this, when you're talking about mandatory vaccinations or mandatory vaccine policies from employers, or mandatory testing in your case, you have to really think about, okay, well, what are your rights, and what are the consequences to those rights? Or I shouldn't say consequences to those rights. What are the practical consequences of not adhering to the company policy? So in your case, they're mandating that you be tested, not vaccinated, but tested, and you're concerned that you have to do this on your own time as opposed to company time. Well, if you refuse to get testing, which I think is a reasonable alternative, regular testing, which is a reasonable alternative to mandatory vaccines, if you refuse to get tested for COVID at whatever interval the company sets out, they might fire you, or they will fire you. And you have to think about, well, okay, can they fire me for just cause for not getting a test on my own time? Maybe not. Maybe it is. That one's an interesting question, and I can dive into it, sort of what all that means in a second. Although I do want to answer some of these other questions which are coming in. But can they would they fire you if you didn't get the test? Yeah, they probably would fire you if you got the test, and so you have to assess whether or not whatever your severance rights were post termination would be worth it for you to pursue, as opposed, while losing your job, or if you'd rather keep your job. And so that's sort of a complicated assessment of what your legal position is pursuant to what's in your contract, how many years you've been there, what your position was, et cetera. So, can they force you to do it on your time as opposed to company time? I suspect that should be on company time, not your own time, if they're making it mandatory. But again, if you refuse to get the test, then they might actually terminate you, probably in that situation. And I don't know what the relationship is like right now between you and your employer, but an amicable resolution might be the best one for you. If you speak to your employer and maybe negotiate with them, maybe they'll be willing to let you go a little bit early on whatever day in order to allow you to get the test. Okay, let's move over to the next one. I have a medical exemption from my doctor. My employer had me leave the office and does not let me return until I'm vaccinated. He's trying to force me off medical leave because of my letter from my doctor. What are my rights? He has not offered any alternative accommodations for me to return. Are you still, Melissa, are you still on medical leave right now? So I didn't quite understand exactly what you said. Are you on medical leave right now, or are you still getting paid by your employer while you are, I guess the question I'm asking is, are you working remotely and still getting paid by your employer to work remotely? I think, though, that is kind of a good segue. You all seem to have very similar questions. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about the imposition of mandatory vaccines, and what your rights are and what the practical effect of mandatory vaccine policy is, and then that might answer a whole bunch of your questions that you guys have coming in, and then I can take specific ones from there. So, okay, the broad question that everyone seems to be asking is, can employers impose a mandatory vaccine upon you? And I think the short answer to that question is no. They can't impose a requirement on you to get a vaccine. Okay. I also think it's very likely probably discriminatory on a human rights basis, but we can get into that in a second. So if they don't legally have the right to impose a mandatory vaccine, but they are doing so anyway, your employers are doing so anyway, what is the practical effect of their doing so? Well, unfortunately, I don't have any magic to tell you today. If your employer changes its policy with respect to vaccines and says all employees must get vaccines, then you refuse to get a vaccine, your employer is probably going to terminate your employment. Okay, and so what I'm really talking about is what are your rights after your termination. Okay, so when I say that your employer has no right to impose a vaccine, that isn't a vaccine mandate or to force you to get a vaccine. That doesn't mean they're not going to terminate your employment. And so you have to assess what your own personal position is with respect to what I'm going to talk about next. What severance, what your severance position is against, your need to have that job on an ongoing basis, which is your own, personal economic and life position against, your own either belief or medical needs, medical imperative to not get the vaccine. So, okay. All right. So your employer can terminate your employment at any time for any reason, barring the human rights protected ground. Human rights protected ground would be like your age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, ancestry, family status, religious belief, criminal record, and the big one is disability, or perceived disability. And I'm going to park that for a second and talk to you guys about that a little bit later, because as I said earlier, it may be that forcing an employee to get a vaccine may also violate that employee's human rights under the Human Rights Act or Human Rights Code, British Columbia. So as I was saying, your only legal right in the event of your termination is severance. Okay, so it's the amount of your severance that matters, and the amount of your severance can come from. And I hope that I'm using the term severance, and I hope all of you understand what that is. I'm not going to go into a deep explanation of what severance is, other than talk about how it's money that you get post termination. That's or because of a termination that is calculated to a variety of factors. So it's the amount of your severance that matters. The amount of your severance can come from one of two places. It can come from, if you're provincially regulated, which I don't want to get bogged down in complications, so I'll just say that 99% of you in the province are probably provincially regulated, and I'll just talk about that. So the amount of your severance can come from the Employment Standards Act, which contains the minimums you're entitled to at law, which are not very generous. So approximately 1 week per year of service that you've been with that company. The other place the amount of your severance can come from is the common law, which is a fancy term for judge-made law. It's decisions by judges over time about severance. Now it's it's much more generous, so that's where you want to be. And in very brief, common law severance is calculated. Actually, before I get into that, so what determines whether or not your severance amount comes from the Employment Standards Act, which is the small amount, or from the more generous common law amount, is your employment contract. You have a valid employment contract that you freely agree to that legally limits you to the Employment Standards Act minimums. There's not really much you can do about that. And so the existence of your employment contract and what it says is everything in the determination of how much severance you get. Okay, so just to really simplify it for you guys, if you get common law severance, you get approximately 1 year, 1 month per year of service. So if you had a 12-year employee making $50,000, they would be entitled to approximately $50,000 of severance. But if they were limited to the Employment Standards Act minimums, they would get only $7,700. Okay, so it's important to understand when you're talking about severance that you get severance, common law or ESA, if you're terminated without cause. Okay, if you're fired for just cause, you get nothing, or if you quit, you get nothing. Okay, so what just cause is, the law has evolved this idea of severance over time because it's a bad outcome if you're thrown out on the street with no money and no job. So severance is to cushion you until you get your next job. So the law wants you to get severance. However, there are some situations where the employer does not have to provide you with severance if it has a legally justifiable reason for doing so. And there are two ways that an employer can get there. One is a single egregious incident in which the employer is justified in no longer continuing the employment relationship and no longer it doesn't have to pay you severance. That would be, classic. You come into work intoxicated, or you steal from your company, or you punch your boss in the face. That kind of serious incident. The other way to get there is progressive discipline. So your classic series of 3 written warnings and then you're terminated and you're not provided severance. Okay, so why am I explaining that? The main question is going to be, for a lot of you, if you refuse to get the vaccine, can your employer terminate you for just cause? I.e., can your employer provide you with no severance and just say you refuse to get the vaccine, you're done, and we don't owe you any money? So, the short answer to that question is no, probably not. I can't see. There might be a very, very limited exception coming out later on for employees who work around vulnerable clients, we'll say, such as in a retirement home or in a hospital. But generally, you've all been working for the last year and a half under the pandemic. You've been doing so either remotely or with social distancing or with PPE. And so just because the employer changes its policy to all of a sudden require a vaccine doesn't mean that you couldn't continue doing the job the way you've been doing it this entire time safely, and therefore there's almost no leg, or I'd say essentially there is no leg for the employer to stand on when it comes to terminating you with just cause. So what all of that really means is you are going to be entitled to severance in the event that you've been terminated, regardless if the employer claims just cause. And I'm sure some employers will do that and are already starting to do that. But you are going to be entitled to severance. It just depends on how much severance you'd be entitled to, which is a legal analysis of your employment contract, your rights under the employment contract that you signed, if you signed any, and then a variety of other factors such as your age and length of service, the nature of your employment, the availability of similar employment. And so for that, it's highly contextual. It's individualized to you specifically. So I would encourage all of you to give us a call or shoot us an email at help@employmentlawyer.ca. If you're worried about this, if you think strongly you're going to refuse the vaccine, there's a strong possibility you could be fired. And so before you refuse to get the vaccine, in the case of your employer mandating it, you want to know what your legal position is. You want to talk to us. You want to find out, okay, well, if I'm going to be terminated, what am I potentially going to get in terms, or what is my best day in terms of severance position? Am I limited to just a few weeks of severance, and I've been at this job for 12 years and I need this job? So, does that factor into my evaluation of whether or not I want to get the vaccine? Versus, you might be on the fence a little bit about whether or not you want to get the vaccine, but your best day severance is $50,000. And so, all of these things are going to play into whether or not you decide to take the vaccine or not, or may play into that. So I strongly encourage you, if you're concerned about this, to, again, shoot us an email at help@employmentlawyer.ca or call us at 1-855-821-5900 and just speak to one of our lawyers so that we can evaluate your specific legal position, so we can put you the best information in your hands so that you can make the best decision for you with respect to mandated vaccines by the employer. I'll comment briefly on the human rights component that I was talking about earlier, and then I will get to your questions and try to answer them as quickly as possible. So as I said earlier, employers are prohibited from discriminating against employees on the basis of a disability. So a classic example, you break your foot, you can't come into work for 6 months while your foot is recovering, and your employer fires you because you have a broken foot. They can't do that. And so not only is there a severance evaluation there that, like we just talked about, but you also get something called human rights damages, which are compensation for the employer's violation of its requirements under the Human Rights Code of British Columbia. And the damages you are awarded are for the injury to your dignity that you suffered for being terminated because you had a disability. Okay, so, if you were terminated because you had COVID, you would certainly have a claim under the Human Rights Code. Question is, if you're terminated because you refuse to get a vaccine, has the employer violated your human rights and your rights under the Human Rights Code? it's we don't know yet, but our position is that yes, it does, and because when you are terminated because of it, you can be, if you're terminated because of a disability, the broken foot example I just gave, or a perceived disability, like we think you have, or the employer thinks you have X illness, and therefore it's terminating you because it perceives that you have that disability. That is a violation of the Human Rights Code, and it tracks human rights damages accordingly. And so with mandatory vaccines, if you're refusing to get them, the employer is in essence terminating you because it perceives that you may have a disability. And so as a result of that, our position is that also violates that if you're terminated because you refuse to get the vaccine, you also have a claim under the human rights regime. Okay, so that finishes my general talk on mandatory vaccines. I will scroll through these and try to answer your specific questions. I saw that someone jumped back in again. So Adam, I've been told that people in the company have been fired without severance. Don't know this is legal. Yeah, no. So I just covered that, Adam. I think I answered your question. If I did not, please let me know. Let's see here. The company implements mandatory If a company implements mandatory vaccines, they will not be covered by insurance. Anyone trying to mandate or enforce it will be the same. COVID and anything to do with it is exempt in insurance. Sorry, Glenn, I don't know if you messaged me directly or not. I don't quite understand your question with respect to insurance. If you could clarify it, I'll make sure that someone gets back to you, or I'll get back to you specifically. If you've been trying to reach us and haven't been successful, or if you've been trying to reach me and haven't been successful, we'll make sure to talk to you as soon as possible. Okay. Adam again, document mandates either vaccine or regular testing. Can you be fired without severance? Okay, so Adam, we did just cover that. I do think, I'll just on that first part that you said, regular test. I think that if your company fires you for just cause, so i.e. no severance, for refusing to get the vaccine, I don't think that it has a leg to stand on, and I think that you'll get severance. But if it provides you with a tailored way to avoid the vaccine, specifically you must get regular testing at whatever intervals, and you refuse, I think it's highly possible that in that case that a just cause termination would be upheld, and so I would encourage you, if your company is giving you those options, that you would get the regular testing. Okay, Melissa, I have a medical exemption from my doctor. Oh yeah, we talked about that earlier and asked for clarification. Okay, so this is the religious exemption question again. How does adherence to a religion look like from a legal standpoint? What type of document is to be presented? So there are religions that I believe, and I don't want to get this wrong, and I apologize if I offend anyone, but I think Jehovah's Witnesses, if I recall, they can't have anything put into their body, so they can't have blood transfusions. There are famous cases where Jehovah's Witnesses need a blood transfusion to survive, and doctors have despite the wishes of the patient, have performed the blood transfusion, and doctors have actually gotten in trouble for that legally. And so I would assume that Jehovah's Witnesses, and again, my apologies if I'm getting the religious beliefs wrong, would feel strongly against, as part of their religion, against getting vaccines put in their body. And so, what would an exemption like that look like? We don't yet know. Like, again, we're talking about this we're not talking about this in the context of the vaccine passports. We're talking about this in the context of, can your employer fire you for just cause, or will your employer be sufficiently satisfied by your religious exemption? And so, in that case, again, very similar to the doctor's note, I would get a note from your religious leader what does it need to say? Well, the basics, that you are a longtime member of this faith, that the tenets of this faith are, you can't, that you can't have whatever put into your body. That includes vaccines, and that your religious leader and your faith require you to not get the COVID-19 vaccine. I think if you have a note like that, you present it to your employer, that's not going to necessarily stop your employer. There's no magic to stop your employer from firing you. What it does do is makes it almost impossible for your employer to claim that it had just cause to terminate your employment, and therefore you'd be entitled to severance afterwards. But I think for most of you, most of you want to retain your jobs if you can, and so you want to, if you can keep the situation amicable with your employers, by handing them a religious a note from your religious leader saying, hey, listen, I have these deeply held beliefs. This is confirmation from my religious leader. I want to continue to work there. I understand, why you're implementing the vaccine. Is there a way we can work around this? Can I work remotely? Can I have physical distancing and PPE? If you can, I'm sure most of you, and I'm not saying all of you, but I'm sure most of you would prefer to figure out some sort of solution that works with your employer in such a way that you get to retain your positions. And so in order to do that, you're for a lot of you, you're going to want to have an amicable conversation with the employer, not come in fire and brimstone and say, my legal rights are that you can't make me do this. Like that's not going to lead to a good outcome for you if your goal is to keep your job. And again, as I keep saying earlier, or as I said many times earlier, whether or not how you tailor your decision here depends on may depend on what your legal position is. And so I strongly encourage all of you to give us a call, send us an email. At the very end of this, I'll give you that information again on how to get a hold of us. Okay. Nicole, I've been told I'm not permitted in the building after October 12th if I'm not vaccinated. There's no option at that point for testing. Sounds like an unpaid leave. Well, it depends if you can work remotely, right? If you can't work remotely, Nicole, and you're only able to work at the office, and they're saying you can't come to the building, they're essentially firing you, right? And so at that point, you have if you're not going to get the vaccine, then you have a severance evaluation pursuant to everything we talked about today. I started my position just before the pandemic and was supposed to work remotely for 3/4 of my time. Now the employer says everyone has to come back to the office. Everyone has to come back to the office, and it'll be evaluated case by case. Yeah, listen. I mean, unless it's in your employment contract that you agreed that you can only work 3/4, you can only work 1/4 of the time in the office. If the employer says, "Hey, you got to work in the office," I don't see any argument you have to not work in the office. It's part of your ongoing obligations to. I'll back up here for a second. In employment law, or the relationship between an employer and an employee is sort of modeled off an old master-servant relationship in Victorian England. So when the employer says to you, "I need you to do X or Y," provided it's reasonable and doesn't offend any of your legal rights, you got to do the thing that the employer wants. And asking you to work come into work is, I think, eminently reasonable. And provided, if you're worried about it from a safety perspective, you certainly have safety rights under WorkSafe BC. So you're entitled to, if you can't work remotely, you're entitled to physical distancing and personal protective equipment. So, face shield, mask, that kind of thing. If they're not, if they require you to come into work and they're not providing you with that personal protective equipment and or physical distancing, and you feel unsafe, then you can bring that to their attention, and or you can speak to WorkSafe BC to have them evaluate whether or not your working environment is in fact safe. You have a lot of questions. It's obviously a hot button issue. I think we're running out of time. Yes, that's it. Yeah. So look, I apologize to everyone for not getting to all your questions. There were a whole bunch that came in. So what I'll say is, again, I'm going to put the information back on the board. You can contact us at employmentlawyer.ca. You can email us at help@employmentlawyer.ca. You can also call us at 1-855-821-5900. We have another session, live chat session on Wednesday of this week. Again, I think most of you are going to be asking questions about this particular topic. I think this is a very it's a hot button topic. Obviously, everyone is concerned about it, as they should be. If you have any additional questions, you can also, you can find me on the website and email me directly. I think it was Glenn. I think you may wish to send me a quick email so I can get back to you. Just there it is. Go to the website, look me up, shoot me an email, Glenn, and we'll get you all taken care of there. To everybody else, thank you very much for all your questions. They were all very, very interesting questions, obviously, and I wish you all the best as you navigate this complicated issue. Please join us again on Wednesday so we can continue to answer your questions about this. And again, email us at help@employmentlawyer.ca so we can provide you with some of the answers to your questions. Anyway, that's all the time I have. I thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to seeing you all next Wednesday.